Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I haven't been making a lot of videos lately. Multiple reasons. One of them is we moved to Florida from Philly, which has a much more pleasant climate, warmer climate, and we've been out much more, but that's besides the point. So what I want to talk about is the Prime Video article that was released recently, and it covered how the Prime Video team moved one of the workloads from a microservice architecture to a monolith. There's a lot of back and forth online on whether this made sense, whether this was clickbaity, this was a mistake initially, and so on and so forth. So I want to cover some of that. One article actually came out saying that, yeah, you see, even Amazon cannot create proper microservices. That's why everything needs to be a monolith. It's a little bit too much, and there's a lot of hype there. So I'm not going to break down the actual article. I'm going to break down some of the components, and not to the detail that an architect would need, but to a detail where a developer or a starting architect or even a senior architect would find it useful. So first of all, let me just make sure that we're on the same page. This article showed a pre-architecture and a post-architecture, and it claimed that the post-architecture has a monolith while the pre-architecture has a microservice. That wasn't the case. I mean, they're still using Lambda, they're still using, they have still decoupled some of the processes. It's just that they coupled other processes and removed some of the unnecessary services from the architecture. So no, it's not a monolith. It's just a coupled application where it made sense to couple it. The other component is they moved away from step functions and Lambda, but they kept another Lambda implementation. So they didn't completely move away from Lambda. So let me talk about Lambda first. I used to be, when I'm part of Amazon, obviously, and at some point of time, I used to be part of a specialty group within Amazon that revolved around serverless. Lambda was the epicenter of serverless. So I'm a Lambda expert, right? I'm a serverless expert. I design applications, I create systems, and architect systems that involve serverless components and microservices. So when I used to meet with customers, I would say that 20% of the time, I discouraged them from using Lambda. It is my job as an expert to tell you how to use a service, but it's also my job as an expert to tell you why not to use a service. But first and foremost, it's my job to architect a solution by working backwards, right? So if you give me the business problem that you're trying to solve or a technical problem, I will give you a solution that is appropriate for this business problem or a technical problem. I'm not gonna lead with the service. Even though I used to be a serverless expert, I wasn't gonna lead with Lambda because Lambda does not fit all use cases. If you hear anyone out there today telling you that there's a service out there and that solves all of your compute problems, or solves all of your database storage problems, or solves all of your AI problems, turn around and stop talking to that person. I'm a little exaggerating, but this is quite serious. What that person is doing is overselling. And as a technical person, I don't need to sell. I just provide a technical solution. So Lambda is great for so many things, but not for everything. When it comes to a lot of the services out there, or a lot of the problems that need to be solved, containers is just as good or better for some things. For other things, Lambda is much better, much faster to start with, much easier to deploy, much easier to create a CI/CD pipeline for. But again, doesn't fit all the usage criteria. So I have a list here that goes over some of the bullet points that I want to cover today. So again, work backwards. Pay attention to limits. Lambda functions, containers, storage, compute, they all have limits. The cloud, it's obviously, you're deploying your applications into the cloud, and it seems like clouds don't have limits, but they do. There's a reason for that, a lot of reasons. Every single service out there has limits. Make sure you understand those limits. Lambda has limits when it comes to size, when it comes to longevity, when it comes to concurrency. Containers have limits when it comes to amount of clusters that you can create, when it comes to amount of IPs that can be assigned, when it comes to a couple of other things. Every single compute, every single service out there has limits. Pay attention to those limits. The third thing I want to say is each tool has a purpose. And I already started saying this about Lambda, right? Each tool has a purpose. You have Lambda, you have EKS, you have ECS, you have Fargate for EKS and ECS. You have EC2 instances, you have Spot for EC2 instances. You have AppSync, you have a whole app runner, you have a whole bunch of solutions out there, and there's a reason why you have those solutions. Not only are they specific to your business or technical problem, but they also have a different pricing calculation or a different pricing chart. Make sure you pay attention to that. Make sure you understand what you're trying to solve, how your application would work, how your application would be architected, what the usage patterns are of your application, or the expected ones at least, and just pick the right tool out of the toolbox. Don't just go with one item every single time. If you're doing that, you're doing it wrong. The other aspect here is pay attention to the price differences. So I already mentioned that a little bit, but let's go over an example, right? So as an example, you have a application that, let's assume it's single threaded, right? And single process, single thread, single instance, and you're storing a lot of data that you need to break up maybe, or you need to work with. Now, let's assume that the two options that you're thinking about is EBS and S3. Well, in both cases, the application can be written to use both EBS and S3. Let's assume that's the case. Now, what you have to pay attention to is how both services are priced. So EBS has one component to its price, which is the storage, the provision storage. S3, on the other hand, has at least two. It has more, but at least two in this particular situation, which is the storage, which is cheaper than EBS, but the storage and the API access, the calls, the amount of times you have to call the S3 service in order to use the data, store the data, retrieve the data, divide the data, delete the data, and things like that. But divide, I mean, split the data or whatever, read the data. You have to understand the pricing component, and in order to make this a viable thing, you have to understand how you're going to use this data that you're storing, how your application is going to be using that data. So you have to combine those aspects, and usually you have to write it out. You have to, it's good to kind of ideate over it, but you have to write out the use cases, understand the use cases, and then come up with a solution. So if your application is doing constant writes to EBS, constant data updates, constant data reads, and it does millions of them, let's say, per minute, right? Well, yes, S3 is cheaper when it comes to storage, but it's not going to be as cheap when it comes to retrieval or storing of the data. So make sure you use the AWS calculator to figure out what the total cost is going to be at the end of the day. So guys, the reason I made this video is I just wanted to kind of suppress the hype and say thank you to the person, to the senior developer who released this Prime Video article. because I think we have to have more conversations that talk about what are the best use cases for the tools that we have in the toolbox. I think that more and more people realize that there's no one solution that fits all of the problems, right? You have to understand what you're trying to solve. You have to talk about it and never default to the same solution over and over again, because you're going to pay the price later on, whether it's in maintenance or it's in cost or it's in just regular headache. Guys, enjoy.